Hello, learners, and welcome to this 12-week NPTEL course on Victorian literature. In this lecture, I will introduce the course and give you a brief overview of how the lessons will move. Now, the first set of 5 lectures constitutes the first section, and in this, I will briefly introduce the subject. This introduction will proceed in 2 parts, historical and a theoretical introduction. The first 2 lectures will provide an historical overview of the developments that occurred and which created the literature which we now recognize as Victorian. In the next 2 lectures, I will talk about some new scholarly approaches to what has become canonized as Victorian literature. These approaches are inspired by critical theories of empire, race, gender, and other scholarly approaches to human identity and history. So, roughly, we will introduce the subject in these 2 ways. Let us begin with a brief discussion of how this period was named and what is the chronological idea of calling a certain body of writing Victorian. Now, the Victorian period has had a very traditional nomenclature. Traditionally, it is understood to last from the years 1837 to the year 1901. Now, these years are the years of the rule of Queen Victoria. She ascended the throne in 1837 and she passed away in the year 1901. Now, naturally, it has struck many observers and many commentators as more than a little strange that the description of a body of writing should emerge so directly from something very arbitrary as the year in which one person ascended a throne and the year in which she died. So there are other ways of dating this period, and there are other contending ideas for how we should date this period, and we'll spend some time thinking about that over the next few minutes. Now, the first problem with dating the Victorian period from the year that Queen Victoria ascended the throne is that before that event, that is, before Queen Victoria ascended the throne, many writers whose work is now canonized and studied as Victorian were already active, right? So just to give some examples, in the 1820s, that is a decade before Queen Victoria ascended the throne, Thomas Carlyle, John Stuart Mill, Thomas Macaulay, Cardinal John Henry Newman were already active and writing what would later become some of their most celebrated, most widely read, and most widely studied work. In the 1830s, that is before Queen Victoria ascended the throne again, Tennyson and Browning were already active. So it begs the question, why should 1837 be used as a cutoff mark or a date on which Victorian writing emerges? Now, given these questions and these facts, scholars and many commentators have come up with other alternate dates. Now, one such date is 1824. 1824 is the year that Lord Byron died. Now, Byron is dead with 3 words that a 14-year-old boy carved on a stone in London. This boy would later grow old to become poet laureate Alfred Lord Tennyson. Similarly, the importance of Byron as a marker of a period that had passed and as a marker of a new period that would emerge can also be found in a work titled Sartor Resartus, which we will discuss in greater detail in the next lecture. In this book, Thomas Carlyle writes, "Close thy Byron, open thy Goethe." Right? Now, this also signifies that it's possible to trace the development of a new style of writing, not simply by the date on which a certain person became a monarch, but also possible by looking at the lives of other writers. Lord Byron was a romantic poet, And the death of Byron can be seen as an important threshold or a milestone at which certain ways of thinking and writing became less popular, and certain other ways of writing and thinking began to grow more popular. So, 1824, the year that Lord Byron died, is a good date on which to start tracing the developments which would create Victorian literature. Now, in addition to identifying the problems with strict historical markers, there are also many overlaps between the era which is known as the Romantic era of English literature and the subsequent period, which is the Victorian period. What are some of these overlaps? Technically, many Romantic poets died before the 1830s. So, the fact that many Romantic poets were no longer alive in the 1830s seems to suggest a very convenient reason for dating the start of the Victorian era in the year 1837. So, who are these writers? John Keats died in 1821, Percy Shelley died in 1822, and Lord Byron, as I just mentioned, died in 1824. However, some Romantic era poets continued to be alive and work well after this period. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was alive till 1834, and William Wordsworth was alive till 1850. To deepen the sense of this overlap between the Romantic and the Victorian eras, we need to remember that Thomas Carlyle, who would become the successor of William Wordsworth as a literary sage, as a very universally respected man of letters, was born less than a month after John Keats. Right? Now, this is something that's very surprising and often forgotten in most conventional and standard histories of English literature, because John Keats is identified as a Romantic poet and Thomas Carlyle is seen as a Victorian writer. So it is important to note that Thomas Carlyle was born less than a month after John Keats. And at the time that John Keats died, Thomas Carlyle was already writing. Although he was not recognized as a Victorian sage, he had begun his career as a writer. He was writing entries for encyclopedias. So these are some reasons why the dating of the beginning of the Victorian era is a complicated matter. Now, the history of printing also points to the year 1824 as being a better contender for the beginning of the Victorian era than the year 1837. In terms of the history of printing, 1824 was the year that a journal was founded, the Westminster Review. And the Westminster Review is an important journal because it played a very important role in the intellectual debates of the time. The goal of this journal, the Westminster Review, or the aim of this journal, was to form a radical counter to two other journals, that is, the Edinburgh Review, which was a Whig journal, and the Quarterly Review, which was a Tory journal. Now, the goal of the Westminster Review was not to take either a Tory or a Whig political side, but rather to take the side of science, that is, objective knowledge. Now, this was an important development in the Victorian era. The more dramatic implications of science would be felt in the second half of the 19th century. But at this point, we are seeing the beginning of this public venue, of this mouthpiece of objective and rational science. Now, a quick detour to understand what is Tory and what is Whig. In terms of their origin, these words, Tory and Whig, began in the parliamentary debates of 18th century England. Now, the debate was whether or not a person, that is James, Duke of York, should inherit the throne. There was a debate on this matter because this person belonged to the Catholic faith. He was a Roman Catholic, and England at that time was very strongly moving towards the Anglican Church, which was a version of the Protestant Church. Now, one group of leaders in the British Parliament, who would later be identified as Whigs, took the more radical, more rebellious position, and they wanted to stop James from inheriting the throne. Right? Now, the word Whig originally referred to horse thieves and was later used to refer to Scottish Protestants. The opposite view, which is that even though James was a Roman Catholic, he should be allowed to inherit the throne because of the divine right of kingship, was taken by a group of leaders who took the somewhat conservative side and who were later identified as Tories. So this was the reigning political debate, and the journal, the Westminster Review, was founded to offer readers an unbiased, or rather a non-partisan view. This is an important development because it shows the increasing respect and validation for objective science. It also shows how knowledge was becoming more and more professional. The implications of this development and this idea will be seen much later in the century, and we will read about this in many of the novels and poems later in the course. Now, let us read what one contemporary had to say about the death of Byron. This is a quote from a book titled England and the English, published in the year 1833 by Edward Bulwer. Right? Now, what did Bulwer say? And I'm quoting now. When Byron passed away, the feeling he had represented craved utterance no more. With a sigh, we turned to the actual and practical career of life. We awoke from the morbid, the passionate, the dreaming. Now, what is the replacement of passion, dreams, and these kinds of emotional things? These things were replaced in the popular Victorian imagination by a utilitarian, more practical, more rational way of thinking. This way of thinking was represented by the thinker Jeremy Bentham. Bentham was a critic of national institutions because Bentham believed that the logic of government should be dictated by efficiency, by utility. No one should gain the right to do anything, or no one should have the power to change the lives of other people unless they can demonstrate that they have the power to make life more efficient. Right? So, appetites, utility, efficiency, these were the key words. And naturally, a way of thinking which prioritized efficiency was bound to challenge more traditional rights of kingship, such as the divine right of kingship or the hereditary right of kingship. So, culturally, the tone of the Victorian era was set by these two writers, one by their absence and the second by his presence, that is, Byron and Bentham. Now, let us try and understand what were the economic and social conditions of this time and how the literature and the culture that developed was a response to these conditions. Right? Let us read what two diarists, that is, not famous writers or not poets or novelists, but ordinary people, professionals, working professionals, what two ordinary people wrote in their diaries in the beginning of the year 1830. Right? So on January 7th, 1830, one Charles Greville writes, "The revenue has fallen off 1 million and more. The accounts of distress from the country grow worse and more desponding." Right? Further, the same person writes, "The country gentlemen are beginning to arrive, and they all tell the same story as to the universally prevailing distress and the certainty of things becoming much worse, of the failure of rents all over England, and the necessity of some decisive measures or the prospect of general ruin." So you can see that this is a time of economic difficulty, and people are confused, people are looking for solutions, people are in distress. Okay, let's read what one more person wrote in their diary. This is General William Dyot, a Staffordshire magnate, then 68 years old. On New Year's Day, 1830, this person writes, "I believe a year never opened with less cheering prospects to a country than the present for old England, distress attending all classes of the community, meetings held in various parts of the kingdom to represent the distress of the country." So it seems to me that this is a time of economic difficulty. Now, one result of this kind of economic difficulty was that much of the writing of the 1830s became practical, political, and less imaginative. Right? So the 1830s are usually considered to be a a decade that is rich with political events as well as writing about those political events. Therefore, writing which was analytical and critical, but not much imaginative or creative writing. So, here's a brief list of all that happened, right? A lot of reform, the growth of political and labor unions, and at the end of the decade, the movement for the redress of the working class, right? And so these were changes that were beginning in the 1830s, right? And also a lot of reform of how government could intervene and change a lot of conditions. What kind of conditions? The laws were made and the conditions were laid for government to intervene in the condition of prisons, of education, welfare, working hours, and public order. So, modern government was established in this decade, and it took a lot of legislation in order to empower the government to be able to take these steps. The Victorian writer Margaret Oliphant describes the lack of imaginative writing thus. The period which witnessed Her Majesty's happy ascension was not in itself a very glorious one, at least as far as literature is concerned. It was a season of lull, of silence and emptiness, such as must naturally come after the exhausting brilliance of the days just gone by. Now, a more productive approach to understanding why the literature of this time was more prosaic and less imaginative was given by Edward Bulwer. And as we've just read from him, we will read more from him now. Just at the time when, with George IV, an old era expired, the excitement of a popular election concurred with the 3 days of July in France to give a decisive tone to the new. The question of reform came on, and to the astonishment of the nation itself, it was hailed at once by the national heart. From that moment, the intellectual spirit, hitherto partially directed to, became wholly absorbed in politics, and whatever lighter works have since obtained a warm and general hearing, have either developed the errors of the social system or the vices of the legislative. Right? So we can see in this quote, there is an explanation for why there is not much imaginative writing. The reason for that is that all of the intellectual energies were diverted towards evaluating what sort of reform, what would be its merits, and how reform could improve the condition of England at the time. Now, a key event of British history and which shaped the Victorian era, both its economic as well as its cultural and literary production, was the Reform Bill of the year 1832. Those of you who have read the novel Middlemarch by George Eliot will be very familiar with this event because it is one of the central events of the novel. A lot of the characters are involved in actually taking part in this reform. It impacts the lives of almost everyone in the novel. The novel makes it clear that the Reform Bill of 1832 was a key and defining event of British history. Where did the event come from? The Reform Bill emerged directly from the distress that we read about in the quotes from Greville and Dyot. Right? The difficulty and the distress that these two writers described led to much unrest and in some cases rioting. And it was the result of this discussion, upheaval, agitation, which led eventually to the passing of the Reform Bill of the year 1832. A brief chronology of that bill. In March 1831, Lord John Russell introduced the bill in the House of Commons. This bill had the following features. It removed parliamentary representation from many small electoral boroughs and gave such representation to the nation's growing industrial centers. So think about that decision. It is saying that the people who are working, that is, the nation's growing industrial centers, right? New centers where people are working, industry, commerce, right? These are the people who should be given the right to vote and the right to stand for election, right? So the future of the nation and the future of the nation's government will be determined not only by those who are in government, but also by those who are involved in business and commerce and industry. It's hard to imagine now how radical a change and how revolutionary and how democratic this change was. However, this was proposed, and at some point it eventually became law. The bill also attempted something else. It also attempted to regularize inconsistencies in the relationship between property holding and the right to the franchise. So, while the right to vote was still confined to people who owned property, it was not universal franchise, but it was still a big step forward from a time when there was no franchise, or rather, when franchise was limited only to a very few people. And by franchise, of course, I mean the right to vote. So, this proposed bill became law finally on June 7th, 1832. Now, there are multiple ways of looking at this reform bill and how its consequences shaped the history and the culture and the politics of Victorian England. Now, one major consequence was that it averted revolutionary change in England, right? And it's important to note that this was a time when revolutionary change, that is radical, violent change, a political change which came with a lot of violence, a lot of death, destruction, that kind of change was occurring almost over all of Europe. England, being a little bit detached from the continent, was ready for this kind of change. Now, because this bill came in, it averted revolutionary change because those demands were satisfied without needing for any kind of violence or death or destruction to life or property. Along with the Municipal Corporations Act of 1835, the 1832 bill may well have saved England from revolution, and it certainly moved the country peacefully and without continental style convulsions towards democracy. And that's exactly what I was saying earlier about the revolutionary change that was sweeping all over the rest of Europe. Continental style convulsions did not happen in England. Instead of a convulsion, there was a steady and slow progress towards democracy. That's what the bill achieved. Another way of looking at the bill is to understand how it was the beginning of more governmentality. It led to more power given to the government to intervene and interfere in the lives of people. Right? It led to more laws which empowered the government to change things. What kind of laws? In the year 1833, new inspectors of factories were appointed. In the year 1834, a new poor law was passed. In the year 1835, there were new inspectors of prisons. So, what these three things do is that they describe how the government takes it upon itself to ensure that the conditions in prisons, in factories, and the conditions of poor people are its own responsibility. Now, this was new because it was unthinkable that the government could take on these responsibilities and assume the right to make changes in these spheres of life. Now, the 1830s also saw the rise of statistics, that is, gathering of select parliamentary commissions on matters requiring reform, of blue books that constituted the gathering of evidence for the purpose, and in general, an almost obsessive documentation of the condition of England question. So, this is what the Reform Bill unleashed. A lot of thinking about the condition of England, and ultimately, this act of thinking about the condition of England also passed on to writers. And we find this question, what is the condition of England, how to improve it, reflected in novels, most famously by Benjamin Disraeli, Elizabeth Gaskell, Charlotte Bronte, and Kingsley. Right? So these are some of the cultural implications of these political debates. Now, one view of the 1832 bill was that it was not new in itself and that it was merely the culmination or the conclusion of trends and forces that were active long before the bill was actually passed. And the more sympathetic and the more celebratory view was that it was in fact quite radical and it enabled something unprecedented, an essentially modern electoral system based on rigid partisanship and clearly articulated political principle. Now, just to get a sense of some real change that the bill enabled, right? From the perspective of the reformers, the bill increased the number of people who could vote, and from 435,000 to 813,000 out of an adult male population of 6 million. So you can see that even though the number of people who could vote is almost doubled, that number is still a minuscule portion of the total number of adult males, which also goes to say, without saying, that this adult male population is still a very small portion of the total population. So even though democracy was a long way from here, the change was incremental and it was a very big step towards democracy. And really, the true significance of the bill and its full democratic potential would become evident much later in the Reform Acts of the years 1867 and the year 1884. Now, what was happening in the field of literature, and specifically what changes took place, and how did they happen in this period? Earlier, that is to say, in the 18th century and the early decades of the 19th century, poetry was the dominant literary form. And this was because paper was expensive. So, because poems were shorter, it was easier to buy a book of poems, it was less expensive. A novel was more expensive to produce and more expensive to buy, which is why, until the early decades of the 19th century, literature was mostly dominated by poems. Now, in the 1820s, a key change happened which made paper and printing more affordable. Machine-made paper and the rotary steam press, two important technological interventions, made prose easier to produce, easier to circulate, and less expensive to buy. Of course, it eventually led to the popularity of novels, but before novels became more popular, magazines and periodicals and newspapers became more widely read. A lot of journals were founded, a short list of journals that were begun before 1832. Blackwood's Magazine, London Review, Westminster Review, Colburn's New Monthly Magazine, and Fraser's. Some of these names will keep recurring in this course as I describe the publication history of some famous novels and poems. These journals published the earliest versions of some of the essays, novels, and poems, which later became canonical books. Now, in the sphere of nonfiction, a lot of sermon-style writing became popular. A lot of intellectuals began to write sermon-style critiques of the present. These were later known as sages of the Victorian era, and the earliest of these was John Stuart Mill. However, later others like Thomas Carlyle also became more popular and influential. We will continue this discussion of the development of prose in the Victorian era by focusing on the work of Thomas Carlyle, and in particular his very influential work, Sartor Resartus, in the next lecture. Thank you.